Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another edition of The Scope here on British Muslim TV. Today, we're going to be discussing the OIC Summit, and we are live, of course, on satellite as well as on BMTV's various social media channels as well. Please do send in your comments as well as suggestions throughout the show if you have any, and we will, of course, if there are any relevant comments, put those to our guests or questions, in fact, as well. So as I said, we're going to be discussing the OIC summit that recently happened, as well as just taking an overview of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation itself. Now, just to remind viewers, the Pakistani Prime Minister, who hosted the OIC Summit of Foreign Ministers just recently last week, spoke about something interesting about the House being divided. And I'm going to quote him exactly now. He said, "We have failed both the Palestinians and the people of Kashmir. I am sad to say that we have been able to make no impact at all." He then went on to say that the West doesn't take the group seriously because we are a divided house and those in powers know it. We Muslims are 1.5 billion people, and yet our voice to stop this blatant injustice is insignificant. Now, of course, a number of questions come up because of that statement, as well as even before that statement was made. There have been criticisms of the OIC overall and its possible ineffectiveness, really. And I'm going to put that issue to both of our experts who are joining us today. We're joined by Dr. John Foley, who is an author and professor of history at Middle Tennessee State University. He specializes in the history of the Middle East, as well as the cultural, political, and religious trends in the wider Islamic world. He's published widely and has delivered public presentations to audiences around the world. We're also joined by Dr. John Esposito, who is an author as well as professor of religion and international affairs and Islamic studies at Georgetown University. He is also the founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, as well as the Bridge Initiative, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia, and that is in the Walsh School of Foreign Service. John and Sean, thank you both for joining us today here on British Muslim TV's The Scope. John, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the OIC and the criticisms against it about it being ineffective? I know that's quite a macro question.
Yeah, I think that actually, if you look at the entire speech, he begins by saying that the OIC actually has not been, he says that the West has been ineffective in responding to Islamophobia, but also refers to the OIC. And one of the criticisms of the OIC has been that the OIC has not condemned what's going on in China with the Uyghurs, and many of the countries have not spoken out about the Uyghurs or the Rohingya, et cetera. When he moves to Palestine and Israel, I think he's on good territory in terms of the issue that he raises. On the one hand, the usual criticism, and the criticism that many of us have is very often when we talk about, let's say, Palestine and Kashmir, but to a lesser extent, certainly in the West, although I think they're equal problems. But it's usually looking at, the role of the U.S. and the EU, but particularly the U.S. and its tilt towards Israel and the way that plays out. But at the same time, I think because of the difference of countries and their foreign policies, they haven't been very outspoken and effective when it actually comes to the Palestinian issue and the reports in the last year of major human rights groups about what's going on in Palestine. And that's a fact.
Yeah, we're going to be going very quickly into a break, of course, our first break. And when we come back, I'm going to be discussing this, of course, with you, Sean, as well, about what exactly will happen. But just if I can very quickly, Sean, just before we go to the break, we have literally just a few seconds. But I want to ask you, do you also think that the OIC is ineffective, though?
I think the OIC shows an insight that Marshall Hodgson had many years ago when he talked about the Muslims of South Asia, where he said the challenge of the Muslims of South Asia is in fact the challenge of Muslims in the world. The basic point that I mentioned at the beginning was Hodgson's notes that the position of Muslims in the world, yes, they're a population of 1.5 billion people or a little more than that, but that's only a quarter of the world's population. And just as Muslims in India are a large population surrounded by many other populations as well. And I think the fact that the Prime Minister is a South Asian, that he's specifically aware of this. And he's also aware, I should note, not only of the position of Muslims in South Asia, but also in the West as well. He spent a lot of time talking about Muslim minorities in the West. And one of the questions become, you're a large population, yes, over 1.5 billion, a quarter of the population, but that means you have to operate with other populations as well. And that's also something I should note that the Prime Minister touched on as well. In fact, he talked on the fact, actually, in terms of his hope for the future, he noted that the changing perceptions of issues like the Palestinians, for instance, was being transformed by how people on social media in the West were looking at these issues. And he himself, in fact, saw as the possibility in the future as perhaps working with these new networks that have emerged in the last 2 decades online and in other places, as an opportunity for the OIC and for Muslims generally to be able to better articulate their view of the world and to find a place where their views can also match those of others on key issues like the Palestinians or Kashmir as well. And that's the question. How do you work as a Muslim community that is as global linkages and global numbers, but for which you have to work with others? It's a very difficult problem, and one for which Muslims have dealt with for a very long time, as Hutchins notes.
Indeed. John, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the fact that, the OIC was, its really founding principle was based on the issue of Palestine. And the fact that that issue has not been resolved yet, that according to even the Pakistani Prime Minister and many others before him, and even, of course, after him, I would imagine, and into the near and midterm future, would discuss how the OIC has failed in that regard. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think sadly, look, first of all, sadly, over the years, from Palestinians' point of view, for many Palestinians, there's been a sense that there has not been sufficient support, not only from the OIC, but basically from many Muslim, countries, Arab and Muslim countries in general. And I think that as we've watched the situation of the Palestinians become even more dire, with an apartheid state being created, with the illegal settlements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the OIC has a chance to play a significant role. But I think that one of the problems that we really need to be aware of is the significant differences among those countries, and how in recent years, in the post kind of Arab uprising period, you have the emergence of countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who are stepping out front to be significant leaders within the Arab and Muslim world, but who really, at the end of the day, are not very concerned about Palestine. If you think about the Abraham Accords and the UAE and many of the countries that are now joining with them, and sadly, not only has it been promoted by President Trump, but also by the Biden administration, it becomes even more important, if possible, to have an OIC that really can respond to the deteriorating and continuing situation in Palestine.
So just very quickly, if I can, John, before I go into this first break, is it essentially the Saudi and these Arab sheikhdoms money that is buying them this, if I may call it, undue influence?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is significant. I must say, though, Saudi Arabia recently did come out and refused to take the position that Abraham Accord, a number of those countries took, along with the UAE, when it came to Palestine. But long term, who knows?
We're just going into our first break. I do apologize for cutting you off there, John. We'll be right back with Sean and John after this. Viewers, please stay with us. Welcome back, viewers. We're continuing our discussion on the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and its ineffectiveness with Sean Foley and John Esposito. Sean, I wanted to get your thoughts on what John there was discussing before the break. And that is really when it comes to the money, right? Because it's been said many, many times that the OIC is ruled by those who have the most money within the Islamic world, and that is essentially the Saudis.
Sure. And again, it should be noted that the OIC is an enormous organization that has very poor states and very wealthy states. Those wealthy states, of course, play an enormous role. Indeed, the OIC is actually based in Saudi Arabia. But I think it's also worth noting that on a smaller scale, if you look, for instance, at the Gulf Cooperation Council, one of the things that's worth noting with the Abraham Accords is the differences in policies that you see even among states that are relatively close in wealth, geography, history and culture, in the Gulf states have had very different policies towards the Arab-Israeli conflict, not only over the years, but specifically in recent years. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has a different policy right now towards the Arab-Israeli conflict than, say, the Emirates or, say, Bahrain do, to neighboring states for which it has had very close and parallel relations for a long period of time. And that's worth noting, that if the Gulf Cooperation Council can't necessarily have the same policy towards a regional issue like the Palestinians, there are significant differences, for instance, on Israel and other issues, then it's difficult to see how an organization far larger, with far different geographies and far different histories, could come as one as well. Remember, the Prime Minister himself hinted at this in his speech. He noted quite clearly that all the different states have their own policies, have their own unique foreign policies. So it's not a surprise at all that these countries are going to have difficulty coming to a common position on even on an issue as emotionally sensitive and as important to the entire Muslim world, and I should note to non-Muslims as well, as the Arab-Israeli conflict or the issue of the Palestinians. This should not come as a surprise at all. And in fact, at a certain level, the fact that these issues are even as important as they are speaks to the ability of Muslims to form linkages with non-Muslim communities as well, something that was hinted very strongly by the Prime Minister as well.
John, Sean there has mentioned, and correctly so, of course, that each member of the OIC, rightfully so, has their own respective foreign policy as nation states on their own. But then if we all within the OIC umbrella agree that Palestine is an issue, I'm still having a hard time understanding why there can't be more unity in that very specific regard then. What is holding back that unity, do you think?
Well, I think that for a number of countries, not just the UAE, but those that follow the UAE in terms of the Abraham Accords, they are dealing with Israel, and they're dealing with opening up to relations with Israel in many ways, in terms of trade, technology, etc. And Palestine has just gone into the background. In fact, within the last year, I forget when it was, but the basically MBZ made a statement that basically marginalized any, the interest in Palestine, as if, we've been concerned about it for years, but, we need to move on and move forward. So I think I agree with Sean that these countries are different and they have different policies. But I think the problem is one needs to get to unity when you see a situation that is as bad and disastrous as the Palestinian situation is, just as the US and EU are subject to criticism and about not at times uniting on certain issues. And many outside of them would say, it's not enough to say that it's just, you're responding to your local needs. If this is a significant situation that actually resonates with your attitude towards human rights and whatnot, one needs to really speak out. And my sense is that the OIC reflects a tendency in many Muslim countries to look the other way. For example, they condemn Islamophobia, as the Prime Minister did, but the Prime Minister really did not talk about the fact that he has avoided saying anything about the Uyghurs in China, and many Muslim countries haven't talked about the Rohingya or what's happening in terms of Islamophobia in India, which is impacting both Muslims and Christians. So I think the credibility of the OIC, like any organization, it's not that the OIC hasn't done some really good things in the past. I mean, I have to say that. In fact, we ran a major conference with them on Islamophobia quite a few years ago. But where we are now on an issue like Palestine, I think the Prime Minister's right. They have to come together.
Sean, if I may just bring in Kashmir for a moment and India. Just last year, in fact, there was a bit of a tension between Pakistan, in fact, within the OIC, as well as, how the OIC then reacted to what India was doing towards the Kashmiri peoples. And, it was, at least according to all intents and purposes and all reports, it was the UAE that blocked an OIC statement against India at that time, saying essentially, and what a lot of people believe is because the UAE has very close economic ties with India, and certainly no one is denying that India is a huge economic powerhouse, and there's a lot of money to be made there. But again, does this go back to economic interests over any moral stance?
Well, two things. First of all, even within these societies, there are differences on issues like the Palestinians. There was a debate a few years ago on Saudi television in a show called Exit 7, where two characters actively debated the position of, say, the Palestinians and other issues. But the backup also, just to mention, there are divisions even within these societies. But the backup on Kashmir, absolutely. India is the third largest importer, effectively, of oil in the world, of energy in the world. That's an enormously important issue, not only for the UAE, but for any energy importer, including Saudi Arabia as well. These are important economic issues that shape foreign policy. There's absolutely no question about that going forward. And those force governments to make complicated and at times difficult choices where they have to be able to balance all those different types of economic interests going forward as well. Just as Pakistan has to make its own choices as well, that John just pointed out as well, that both of these issues are incredibly important. And at a certain level, it depends on what issue is more important and where economic or strategic interests lie. And those are important issues for both the Emirates and for Saudi Arabia. There's no question about that. And again, at a certain level, it depends on where you sit and how you define it.
You know, John, the tension that I'm referring to that happened last year, of course, over Kashmir, was quite severe in the sense that I remember the Pakistani foreign minister even casting doubt on whether or not, you know, Pakistan would even necessarily remain within the OIC if it saw that, you know, there was no action on Kashmir. And we can, of course, talk about hypocrisy, as you mentioned in your earlier answer. But I wonder, in a sense, is the OIC losing its legitimacy, or has it already lost its legitimacy?
I think the danger is that the OIC, well, certainly, I would say, in the eyes of the victims, whether it's the Palestinians, the Uyghurs, et cetera, its legitimacy is up for grabs. I mean, it's just a reality, and it's, again, you know, I would underscore, as Sean did, that the countries do have, you know, different priorities, but at the end of the day, the question is, can they come together? Many of us have criticized, for example, and said that the US and European countries have different policies, but when it comes to world issues and world events, when it comes to democracy, human rights, you know, we will wind up saying it's not enough to say we're dependent on oil. As we say when it comes to the Ukraine, you know, whether it's Europe or the US, it's not enough to say that we're dependent on Russian oil, et cetera. If you're talking about the big questions, and for the OIC, the big questions for them have to do with the conditions of Muslims in Muslim countries and whether or not they're not being, you know, basically as when it comes to the Uyghurs, you know, put in the equivalent of concentration camps. Genocide is taking place. So I think more and more, as the word genocide gets used for the Rohingyas, you know, for you know what's going on with the Uyghurs, the OIC is going to have, I think, even more pressure from some saying on this kind of thing, whatever the differences have been, we have to step up. I mean, because it's built on, the OIC is based in many ways on the notion that there is an ummah, you know, and so of Muslim countries.
Right.
Yeah, you know, Sean, that's a good point. And, you know, and John there has mentioned the Uyghurs, and I don't want to ignore that. I do want to talk about the Uyghurs as well. And I think it's important to mention because the Chinese, there was a very high ranking Chinese official at this latest OIC Foreign Minister Summit as well. And he had a very high level meeting with the Prime Minister of Pakistan too. Why is a huge part of the Muslim world ignoring the Uyghur issue? Again, that all goes back to economic issues, doesn't it?
Sure, absolutely. And I should note one other thing. When we talk about the OIC itself, part of the tension here, and I think we need to be careful about this just for a moment, the OIC had a very strong statement about Kashmir and about issues in Kashmir in 2019 and 2020. Yet nonetheless, there was effectively still criticism that was done. Part of the issue is, are we talking about the OIC when we talk about these governments, or are we talking about the policies in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, and other important Muslim countries in the world? And that's a difficult question. In the same way, are the United Nations, or say NATO, or other types of issues separate from their most important and largest countries that are part of them or not? And that remains an open question in that sense of the world. But there's no question in my mind that economics and strategic issues, particularly say when defining Pakistan's relationship with China, define how these countries define their foreign policies. Again, Khan said it clearly. We all have our own, every Muslim country has their own interest and their own foreign policies. We shouldn't forget it. And again, we should note again, they're only a quarter of the world's population are Muslims and they're in a larger world in which they're divided. I think the image of India, again, is important when we think about these issues. And again, India itself has these issues when dealing with as well. All these are economic issues. And the question becomes not only economics, but a simple question of numbers, not just of economics, but of people and place in the world.
John, very quickly before I end the show, I wanted to ask you, do you think that we need to then refer back to the United Nations instead to resolve issues even in the Muslim world?
I think the UN can play a role. I mean, it's played a role, for example, in basically coming down very heavy on the Israelis basically declaring human rights groups as terrorist groups. But the UN also has its limitations. And you know, I think at the end of the day, the question for the OIC is going to be what's really different about the OIC? Otherwise, why do you need the OIC?
Indeed. Very well. We're going to leave it there at that, Sean and John, but we really appreciate both of you taking your time to speak to us today. Viewers, come back with us, of course, next week for another episode of The Scope here on BMTV. Thank you for watching today.